Good afternoon, and thank you for organizing this very nice workshop. And it's my pleasure to participate in this workshop. So the title of my paper is philosophy simply without metaphysics is disarrayed. Shuzo and metaphysics. The philosophical relationships between Heidegger and Kuki Shuzo are well known and have often been discussed. Many studies on the relationship between the two philosophers seem to focus on Kuki's reception of Heidegger's philosophical method, phenomenology, and hermeneutics. As well known, this influence from Heidegger on Kuki is evident, for example, in the structure wiki. However, what I see as most important is that Kuki was obsessed with physics. In his theory of temporality, he systematizes the metaphysical temporality as repeating temporality. He describes the problem of contingency as a problem of metaphysics. Even when discussing literature, he raises the issue of the metaphysics of literature. It is therefore fair to say that metaphysics drives Kuki's philosophy. In a poem written during his stay in Paris, he wrote as follows. A philosophy without metaphysics is disarrayed. I long for metaphysics, which systematizes the existence and death of human beings. This quote is often said to imply that Kuki needed Heidegger's philosophy because Kuki refers to the existence and death of human beings. This quote, however, shows Kuki's longing for metaphysics, but does not clearly show why he is longing for it. Actually, it is hard to answer this question entirely, at least in this paper. But this paper tries to describe the significance of Kuki's obsession with metaphysics. For this purpose, this paper will examine the relationship between Heidegger and Kuki from the perspective of metaphysics. This paper argues the following. Firstly, Kuki's longing for metaphysics culminated in his own metaphysics under the influence of Heidegger's thought in the so-called metaphysical period of 1929. In other words, Kuki's obsession with metaphysics had its background in his dialogue and confrontation with Heidegger's thought. Secondly, because Kuki took on Heidegger's metaphysics, he also inherited the problems with metaphysics that Heidegger later criticized. Kuki's longing for metaphysics. As many previous studies show, Bergson is important to think of the starting point of Kuki's metaphysics. Kuki states in his short essay, Bergson in Japan, that Bergson philosophy drove our motivation for metaphysics. Kuki focuses on Bergson's metaphysical intuition. What Kuki learned from Bergson was to create concepts that suit our intuition rather than being satisfied with established concepts and to place ourselves inside concrete reality through the effort of intuition. This philosophical attitude that Kuki inherited from Bergson was, aside from whether or not Kuki was actually able to maintain this attitude, the fundamental attitude of Kuki's own philosophy. However, Kuki's obsession with metaphysics cannot be exhausted by the influence of Bergson alone. For Bergson does not regard the problem of contingency and that of nothing as a fundamental problem of philosophy, but pseudo-problem. In other words, Bergson's metaphysics does not fully explain why Kuki makes the issue of contingency and the problem of nothing relate to it, the topic of his discussion. It is remarkable that Kuki refers in this essay to the evaluation of German phenomenology as a secondary effect of the reception of Bergson in Japan. Kuki sees the same consequences of the method of intuition as Bergson in Husserl's intentionality and Heidegger's being in the world. Kuki's motivation for his metaphysics, driven by Bergson inevitably led him to German phenomenology, and in particular to Heidegger. So, Cooke's metaphysics. Cooke often uses the words metaphysics or metaphysical, but it is not entirely clear what he means by metaphysics. Let us start by drawing out the outline of Cooke's concept of metaphysics. This paper will characterize Cooke's metaphysics as a transcendental speculation that departs from the horizontal dimension of reality and moves towards the hypothetical vertical dimension. In short, in my view, the central motif of Cooke's metaphysics is nothing but verticality. Let us begin with the theory of temporality. In his lecture in Pontini in 1928, The Notion of Time and the Resumption of Time in the Orient, Cooke describes the unique structure of temporality as a crossing of phenomenological ontological ecstasy as a horizontal plane and the metaphysical mystic ecstasy as a vertical plane. As he explicitly mentions, the idea of phenomenological ontological ecstasy comes from Heidegger's discussion on temporality in Being and Time. As Heidegger summarizes, the issue in Being and Time is a primordial explication of time as a horizon of the understanding of being, in terms of temporality as being of Dasein, which understands being. For this purpose, Heidegger reduces the structure of the understanding of being to that of care, Sorge, and shows that unity of three ecstasies as the structure of care, that is, the present, having been, and the future. However, Cooke is unsatisfied with Heidegger's horizontal ecstasy. Cooke provides metaphysical mystic ecstasy as a vertical plane in addition. In which sense is this ecstasy metaphysical then? In Heidegger's theory of temporality, namely phenomenological ontological ecstasy, time is not understood as a collection of flat and static now, but rather from imminent possibilities of Dasein, that is future. In contrast to the emphasis on the future in phenomenological and ontological ecstasy, temporality of the present is emphasized in metaphysical mystic ecstasy. However, this present is also not flat and static now, but an infinitely profound moment. While in phenomenological ontological ecstasy, the continuity and irreversibility of time from the past to the present and into the future are premised. In metaphysical mystical ecstasy, on the other hand, the non-continuity and reversibility of countless infinitely profound moments are assumed. The most important difference between phenomenological ontological ecstasy and metaphysical mystical ecstasy is that the former is realistic and the latter is hypothetical. In other words, while phenomenological ontological ecstasy is based on our everyday experience, metaphysical mystical ecstasy is beyond our everyday experience. In the case of metaphysical mystical ecstasy, we are not involved in the reality of our own finite horizon of temporality, but rather in the infinite that transcends phenomena. Here, the word ecstasy goes back to the original meaning, that is, ecstasy in the religious and mystical sense. Therefore, the vertical plane of temporality is metaphysical in the sense that it transcends our finite reality or phenomena and moves toward a religious or mystical infinity that lies beyond our experience. Verticality of metaphysical mystical ecstasy implies this direction of transcendence. However, we must notice that these two ecstasies are not merely opposed to each other, but are crossing, which shows that metaphysical mystical ecstasy cannot be conceived without phenomenological ontological ecstasy. What Cookie is attempting in his theory of temporality is to describe the structure of time by placing himself on the phenomenological and realistic horizon of time, while transcending to the hypothetical and vertical plane of time. This attempt also suggests the philosophical attitudes that Cookie inherited from Bergson, that is to place ourselves inside concrete reality through the effort of intuition, which we have already seen. Let us move on to Cookie's theory of literature. Shall we look at his essay, The Metaphysics of Literature, which is based on his lectures from 1933 to 34. While he says that metaphysics means just a general philosophy, in contrast to aesthetics, it is evident that his discussion on literature inherits his metaphysics of temporality. Here, Cookie tries to reveal the essence of literature in the horizon of temporality. In this discussion, he maintains that the character of art, including literature, is the intuition of which temporality is seen as the present. Cookie grasps this present as a temporality of literature as multi-layered qualitative present. This multi-layeredness is understood as the double characteristics of the sensuality of language, that is perception of sound, and the ideality of language, that is linguistic imagination. Considering Cookie explained the temporality of literature of the present in this essay by the same expression as in his theory of temporality, namely the infinitely profound eternal moment, we can grasp this double characteristic of the language in literature as a crossing of the realistic and horizontal plane and hypothetical and vertical plane of temporality. It is also remarkable that Cookie explained that the plane of the present as a temporality of art is crossing with human history at the right angle. Although there is an expressive difference, we can also see the motif of verticality in Cookie's metaphysics here. Finally, let us look at his theory of contingency. The most essential point of Cookie's thought of contingency seems to lie in the introduction of his work, The Problem of Contingency. He says contingency is a negation of necessity. As Obama argues, how we grasp this negation is the key to understanding Cookie's philosophy of contingency. This negation does not mean a merely logical or privative negation, but negation in a positive sense, that is, together belongingness of being and nothing. Cookie defines contingency as, for example, being containing the negation or being possible not to exist. Therefore, the crucial sense of contingency is together belongingness of being and nothing. As we cannot think of light without shadow, or shadow without light, it is impossible to think of being without nothing, or nothing without being. In short, there is no being itself or nothing itself. So Cookie regards the problem of contingency as a problem of metaphysics. In this work, he defines more evident than other works what he means here by metaphysics. For Cookie, the core meaning of metaphysics is going over being toward nothing. Cookie's metaphysics attempts to confront Western metaphysics, which lies in line with the philosophy of necessity from the perspective of contingency, while standing within the tradition of Western metaphysics. At the same time, according to him, contingency as the together belongingness of being and nothing is the source of metaphysics, that is, philosophy. Now we can find a similar motif as we have seen in his theory of temporality and literature. Cookie defines the core meaning of metaphysics as going over, being toward nothing. Going over here means nothing but transcendence. Considering that, Cookie defines contingency as being containing the negation or being possible not to exist. Nothing, which belongs together with being, is not realistic and substantial. So we can associate the together belongingness of being and nothing with the crossing of the phenomenological ontological ecstasy and metaphysical mystical ecstasy. If our reading is correct, being can be seen as a realistic and horizontal plane, and nothing can be seen as a hypothetical and vertical plane. The fact that Fuki determines the temporality of contingency as present could also support our reading. Metaphysics in his theory of contingency can be summarized as follows. Transcendence from being as a realistic plane to nothing as a hypothetical plane. Here, we can grasp the verticality as a direction that transcends physical form, keijika, into metaphysics, keijo. Fuki's dialogue and confrontation with Heidegger informing his metaphysics. As we have seen above, the core motif of Fuki's metaphysics that runs through his theory of temporality, literature, and contingency can be understood as a transcendental speculation that departs from the horizontal dimension, reality, and moves to the hypothetical vertical dimension. Now, let us look at the background of his metaphysics. What is the motivation behind his metaphysics? First, let us focus on his emphasis on the present. As we have already seen, the present is emphasized as an infinitely profound moment in metaphysical mystical ecstasy in contrast to phenomenological ontological ecstasy, which prioritizes the future. This emphasis on the present is a common motif that can be seen not only in his theory of temporality, but also in his theory of literature and contingency. His emphasis on the present can be explained by his dissatisfaction with Heidegger's being and time. While Kuki sees the temporality of contingency as a present, Heidegger thinks of it as having been, gewesen, because he relates contingency with our thrownness or facticity. Although Heidegger also discusses the present, the definition of the authentic present, which Heidegger calls the moment of vision, Augenblick, seems to be insufficient. What Kuki was dissatisfied with is that the temporality of the present has a negative role as foreign. Based on this criticism of Heidegger, Kuki attempts to enrich Heidegger's moment of vision, which is determined merely in an empty way in being and time, as a temporality of contingency. That is the infinitely profound moment. The crossing of phenomenological ontological ecstasy and metaphysical mystical ecstasy can also be regarded as a result of Kuki's attempt to deepen the significance of the present by confronting Heidegger while inheriting Heidegger's phenomenological theory of temporality at the same time. His metaphysics of temporality is based on his dialogue and confrontation with Heidegger's being and time. However, it seems that the relationship between Kuki and Heidegger cannot be exhausted by his relationship with being and time. This is because, regarding his theory of contingency, we can clearly notice an influence from Heidegger's thoughts after being and time. As Mian suggests, Kuki's project of philosophy of contingency as metaphysics is influenced by Heidegger's What is Metaphysics? In this work, Heidegger maintains that being and nothing belong together and that metaphysics lies in essence of human being. According to him, anxiety, which reveals nothing behind being, leads us to ask the phenomenal metaphysical question. That is, why there is being at all? Why not rather nothing? In Kuki's lecture, Contingency, and Heidegger's Phenomenological Ontology, he cites the definition of Dasein from Heidegger's What is Metaphysics? Dasein means being held out into nothing. Dasein heißt Hineingehaltenheit in das Nichts. As Mian argues, Heidegger's idea that nothing runs through our existence motivates Cooke's question of contingency. That is why Cooke's investigation of contingency is based on his reception of Heidegger's philosophy in 1929. As I mentioned above, Erickson's metaphysics does not fully explain why Cooke makes issue of contingency and the problem nothing related to it, the topic of his discussion. Now we can find the source of Cooke's metaphysics of contingency in Heidegger's metaphysics. Let us develop this point further, focusing on the concept of transcendence. In Heidegger's what is metaphysics, being of Dasein held out into nothing is determined as being beyond beings as a whole, in which Heidegger named transcendence. This formulation of transcendence, namely being beyond beings as a whole and held into nothing, can be associated with Cooke's formulation of metaphysics, going over being toward nothing. In addition, we will pay attention to Heidegger's expression as a whole. This expression characterizes Heidegger's thoughts in the so-called metaphysical field, the field of metaphysics. And in the problem of contingency, Cooke distinguishes metaphysics as philosophy in the essential sense from other sciences. According to him, other sciences only deal with fragments of being, which means that metaphysics in turn deal with being as a whole in its together belongingness with nothing. Considering this point, it could be fair to say that Cooke's metaphysics inherits from Heidegger's metaphysics of Dasein. The discussion so far can be summarized as follows. Cooke's longing for metaphysics, driven by Bergson, led him to dialogue and confrontation with Heidegger's being and time, and in the end, he came to resonate with Heidegger's metaphysics in 1929. And Cooke's essentialism. So if Cooke is a good student of Heidegger and takes over Heidegger's metaphysics, as we have seen, then I wonder if he has also inherited the difficulties of Heidegger's metaphysics. The significant difference between Cooke and Heidegger lies in the attitude toward metaphysics. While Cooke is engaged in metaphysics in his entire philosophy, Heidegger, on the other hand, begins to criticize metaphysics in the 1930s in contrast to his thoughts in 1929. We will not go into Heidegger's critique of metaphysics in detail here. However, if we summarize it briefly, we can say that the focus of his critique of metaphysics is transcendental speculation or transcendental grounding. This critique is not only directed at the traditional Western metaphysics, but also his own previous thoughts. As far as I understand, Heidegger's transcendental thinking up to 1929 prevents him from exploring the equiprimordiality of truth and untruth. In Being and Time, Heidegger regards running resoluteness as the most primordial truth of existence, while he maintains the equiprimordiality of truth and untruth in Dasein. In What is Metaphysics, though he states the together belongingness of being and nothing, he argues, on the other hand, being is revealed only by transcending being as a whole into nothing. Such incongruity regarding the equiprimordiality of truth and untruth is rooted in Heidegger's conception of the metaphysics of Dasein. It seems that Cookie also inherits difficulties regarding his incongruity from Heidegger because he undertook Heidegger's metaphysics. We will take up the theory of contingency. As we have seen, Cookie determines contingency as a negation of necessity. This determination is based on the idea of the together belongingness of being and nothing. Cookie, however, seems to betray his premise of the equiprimordiality of being and nothing, as Heidegger does. The reason lies in that Cookie uses the expression being enveloped by nothing, or that being is eroding nothing, to express the together belongingness of being and nothing, which can be evidently associated with Heidegger's metaphysics, as we have seen, and which seems to show that nothing is more primordial than being, in contrast with his assertion of equiprimordiality of being and nothing. Although Obama characterizes Cookie's philosophy as the metaphysics of light and shadow, Cookie's thoughts, in fact, tend to fall into the metaphysics of shadow. This incongruity, which he inherited from Heidegger, actually poses a decisive difficulty for Cookie's philosophy. Tanaka points out that the problem associated with Cookie's metaphysical standpoint is exposed in the problem of contingency. According to Tanaka, while Cookie pursues contingency, his thoughts tend to favor necessity. And Tanaka argues that while Cookie understands contingency as a duality that lifts up identity or necessity, he constantly demands a higher level of necessity in order to soothe up the rift caused by contingency. Tanaka identifies the cause of this as Cookie's failure to thoroughly investigate nothing as the essence of contingency due to together belongingness with being. However, I rather think the problem of Cookie's philosophy lies in considering the essence, whether it will be being, the essence of being, the essence of nothing. In my view, only by thoroughly investigating the together belongingness of being and nothing can we grasp contingency as such. In the case of Heidegger, he tries to solve the incongruity by criticizing his transcendental thought and understanding the truth of being as the strife of concealment and unconcealment of being in 1930s, which will make it, I think, possible to grasp being as such, or in turn, concealment as such. In addition to that, Cookie's obsession with metaphysics leads him to essentialism. While Heidegger began to use the word essence as a verb in 1930s, Cookie still understands its essence in the traditional metaphysical sense due to his obsession with metaphysics. Others point that Cookie's metaphysics changed to metaphysics as a universal idea after the problem of contingency could also be explained from this perspective. According to Oda, in Cookie's essay, What is Anthropology? By introducing the concept of actual infinity through Japanese mythology, Cookie has lost sight of the individual and become a nationalist who advocates becoming an ideal human being who will realize the ideals of the nation. As Oda points out, this indicates that infinite, which in Cookie's previous discussions has remained potential, is discussed as actual. However, in my opinion, this change in Cookie's argument is a continuous one that is rooted in his obsession with metaphysics. The infinity in the metaphysical dimension that had remained hypothetical in his theory of temporality, for example, is substantialized as actual infinity by being linked to the essence of Western metaphysics due to his obsession with metaphysics. Kuki's tendency toward existentialism, which also led him to nationalism in his late thoughts, is the destiny of his obsession with metaphysics. That's all. Thank you.
So this time we have more or less 15 minutes for discussion. Please.
I'm not a specialist, certainly not a cookie specialist in anything anymore. So this is just a really honest question. What does the word transcendence mean? And if if this was a entirely Western thinker, I'd have a sense of what transcendence means. And within Heidegger, I think I have a sense of what transcendence means, but I'm not sure I have a sense of what transcendence means here. Transcendence of what? What is this nature of this transcendence? My reason for my question is I sense that when scholars coming out of a European tradition like myself speak about or hear the word transcendence, you have a very specific background that's informing how we understand this term. And I perpetually get the sense that when Japanese scholars speak about transcendence or people speak about transcendence within certain philosophical tradition, what they're speaking about is something different. And so this is an honest question. What does this word transcendence mean?
Okay, thank you for your question. So it's I think, a very important point. So as far as I understand, so Cookie uses not so like transcendence, I think. But on the other hand, so in this paper, I mean transcendence in Heideggerian term. It's like Heidegger uses transcendence of Dasein. It's like here. So my argument is that so Cookie inherits metaphysics or the idea or the conception of metaphysics from Heidegger, and this means that here metaphysics also metaphysics of not in the traditional sense, but I think more like can I say the existential metaphysics like of Heidegger or Heidegger's was metaphysics of Dasein, so metaphysics of Dasein, and here transcendence means it's like so. For example, the Heidegger then okay, so in Heidegger in Heidegger's philosophy, transcendence means, for example, through our understanding of being, we how to say it, we understand beings as beings, like we can we can be in the world, and or in what is metaphysics then transcendence means from being, or in I think the cookie inherits the same motif from being of from being to into nothing. This is it's like so how to say? Here I mean the. So for Heidegger, then transcendence is like how to say proposition. It's like so because of our transcendence, we can understand something as something. This is, I think, the core meaning of Heidegger's transcendence. And but here, I think so Cookie says in metaphysics is like from form or from beings into over the form or into the nothing. I think it's very specialized sense. And this motif comes from, I think, the Heidegger's explanation of transcendence in his paper, What is Metaphysics? And in this paper, I think the transcendence is like the possibility, it's like a process, presupposition, yeah. The presupposition of our question of being or our understanding of being. And then, so I use this term, it's in specialized sense or in Heidegger's sense. And I think the Cookie inherits also the same motif. Or maybe in other words, maybe the transcendence here is like not action, but it's like understanding. It's like a more dynamical.
We would like to hear about Japanese philosophy, not about Heidegger.
And I think
Don't you?
Yes.
you also say that, at least as far as I understood it, that what for Cookie is metaphysics is for Heidegger, it's a kind of movement, right?
I think so.
And metaphysics in Cookie is not a discipline.
Not discipline. It's like a method.
It's a movement, I think. Instance, right?
Yeah.
And here we can see some overlap between Heidegger and Cookie. That's what you say. I'm sure about him. But as far as I understood you, here I see some ground we can find similarities, proximity and distance between Cookie and Heidegger.
Yeah.
So how the two understood metaphysics. And I think the difference or the distance towards Heidegger is that maybe for Cookie, metaphysics is an ahistorical. As for Heidegger, it's profoundly historical category.
Yeah.
The whole history of Western metaphysics beginning from Plato until Nietzsche and maybe Nishida. This whole has a historical dimension which is absent in Cookie, which is why Cookie did not criticize. So I try to make sense.
Yeah, I think so. This is a very big, significant difference. So yeah, of course, I think this point relates to my last section. I think so. Heidegger has a motivation for criticizing the Western philosophy. That's the history of philosophy. But Cookie, on the one hand, of course, he confronts the philosophy of necessity. It's like the traditional Western metaphysics of philosophy, but maybe so. Of course, unlike to Heidegger, so he has no interest in the history of being like that. Yeah, and then another point is that I think Cookie's concept, well, it's like a metaphysics. It's also important that he at first was driven by Bergson. Yeah, this is I think that the metaphysics I understand in Heideggerian way, but I think somewhat a bit combination with Bergson and Heidegger. Because so he learned from Bergson is like we are staying in reality, but how to say making the effort of our intuition, then we can reach the absolute. This is what he learned from Bergson. And this motive, and I think that Bergson has no interest in nothing like that. So I think this movement of transcendence and metaphysics is like a combination.
A question from Professor, if I spell correctly, Jinlan or Jinlan. I'm sorry if that mean.
Close enough. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for your paper. It was helpful for me to, hear more or hear about, ways that Kuki is drawing on Heidegger and also trying to break from him. I was wondering if you could say more about his reaction to Heidegger's notion of facticity. What I understood you to say is that the way Kuki was interpreting it was merely negative, that, it's associated with the past, and for Kuki with falling, whereas I think for Heidegger, it has a more positive sense, the past as tradition opens up possibilities. And I was wondering if, one difference I was thinking of when I read your paper title was the emphasis on the notion of causality in Kuki's notion of contingency, and that might reflect Bergson's influence, right? I mean, when Bergson talks about free will, he talks about it in connection with causality, whereas Heidegger's discussion of freedom, he's very explicit that it needs to be separated from causality. And so I thought that might be a useful, a productive way of distinguishing them. But I was curious if, what your sense is.
Thank you. So I'm not sure whether I catch up your question, and can you summarize in a little shortly?
Sure. Yeah. So the first part is, can you say more about Kuki's reaction to Heidegger's notion of facticity? And the second was, do you think causality is a relevant, difference between, Kuki's notion of contingency and, say, Heidegger's, notion of facticity, if that means something like contingency, that, causality seems important for Kuki, whereas Heidegger tries to exclude it. So.
Okay, thank you. So the first point, so Kuki's reaction to Heidegger's, and then
And facticity.
So facticity, and then so it's I think sometimes when we look at Kuki's criticism of Heidegger, sometimes it's find difficult, or it finds a bit complicated, because Kuki, I think this is Kuki's strategy. I don't know, but I think he criticizes Heidegger's being on time, always being on time, but he knows that the perspective is like from the, I think, so he know about Heidegger's thoughts in 1929 is a metaphysical period. It's like which Heidegger more emphasizes facticity or Geworfenheit, so strongness. And I think Kuki's criticism, at least in the problem of contingency, then he criticizes Heidegger's being uptight, but the core of thought is can be resonated with Heidegger's thoughts after being time. And of course, for example, the Kuki's criticism of Heidegger is, I think the 3 or 2 points can be summarized. At first, of course, Kuki was dissatisfied with temporality of presence in Heidegger's philosophy. And second is, I think the Heidegger's philosophy is lack of space or the other. That is why Kuki deal with encountering with others in the problem of contingency. But in my view, I think this is, I think, Kuki's confrontation with Heidegger, and we can see the effort of confronting with Heidegger still in the problem of contingency, but I'm not sure it's succeeded or not. Now I think not so sufficiently. And the second point, and I think second point is
Causality.
yeah, causality. Thank you. And so I think so. If we take up the problem of contingency again, then he constructs this contingency in 3 dimensions or 3 phases: logical and empirical and metaphysical. And then I think the causality, the theme of causality lies in the empirical phase in his discussion of contingency. And I think I'm not sure, but I think there is also the similarity between the Heidegger strategy and Cooke's metaphysics, Cooke's strategy, because he begins with a logical dimension and empirical and metaphysical. And if we take up the Heidegger's theory of truth, for example, then he says at first logical is a SSP, like the logical dimension, and then he uses more like a perception, like our experience. Can we summarize maybe? Then he finds more not metaphysical, but it's like the openness of our existence, like which finds all the truth system like that. And in that sense, I think, of course, as far as I know, Heidegger refers most causality as like Cooke, but I think that this strategy or structure is, can we compare or can we find the similarity, I think? Sorry, I'm not sure, but yeah.
But I mean, you said that, causality appears, I think explicitly in the second phase phase of his discussion. But doesn't necessity still, that's still present in, or is present in the third one, the metaphysical discussion of contingency, right?
Yeah. So
okay, contingency as possibility as opposed to necessity, and his discussion, he has fate is an important notion there, correct?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Something. Yeah. So I think that it's a similar, but the difference is that Cookies find the metaphysical dimension, metaphysical contingency at last in his book of the problem of contingency. But the strategy is that he finds the first is he try to go back to the causality, right? The effect, always the cause and effect and cause and effect, and at first maybe we can find this is a traditional discussion, but it's a first moment, first movement, like first causes or a mover like that. And Cookie says that this is but it's not necessity. No? It's like it's like together belongingness between the metaphysical necessity and the metaphysical contingency. And Heidegger, of course, yes, it's true. Heidegger does not take this strategy. Heidegger not so like this way. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. And I would like to, if I may, I would like to return to Professor Roth's question concerning the notion of transcendence in the context of Japanese philosophy. And I would like to take, for example, I would like to take Cookie's first lecture at Fonteny as an example or as a starting point for this question. And I was wondering what Cookie means or what you mean in interpreting Cookie when Cookie talks about the so-called vertical ecstasy, in contrast with the horizontal ecstasy. That is based on, as you truly say, based on Heidegger's ideas. And so, what is vertical? What does this mean? This is the point of my question. And in my opinion, we have at least two possibilities to interpret this. One possibility of interpretation would be that this notion, the notion of transcendence, could mean what is imaginary or what is thinkable, but at the same time is not is or can be consistent with our empirical reality. Imaginary, but consistent, so compatible with reality. As you know, in this first lecture at Pontini, Kuki uses the word or the term in Japanese, hasoteki. And if I rightly remember, in the French version of this essay, Kuki uses the word maybe idel, corresponding to the word kasoteki. So I was wondering whether
Ideal.
idel, not ideal, ideal. If I correctly remember. So I personally think that the notion ideal is quite different from that of hypothetical that you use in this presentation. Why? Because so to me, the notion of ideal sounds like something which is thinkable, which is imaginary. Yeah, we can think about that. Yeah, and so it's not so we can't we don't have to combine what is imaginary, not necessarily with what we presupposes or what we put as an hypothesis for someone. So in short, what is imaginable, what is thinkable is much broader than what we call a hypothesis. And another possibility of interpreting what Kuki means by when he talks about horizontal or transcendence, if I may say so, would be that by this notion or by this term, Kuki means, so to speak, macrocosmos in contrast with microcosmos. So, in this context, I can draw on Kuki's essays, short essay on Bergson in English, Bergson and Heidegger. And in this short essay, Kuki clearly refers to the contrast between microcosmos and macrocosmos. So with a special attention to Bergson's, I cannot remember correctly, but some notion of Bergson. And the second so possible interpretation would or could imply that Cookie's notion of vertical might be interpreted as not merely as something thinkable, but as how should I say? So super empirical or a very, very higher level, something is at a very, very higher level than our empirical reality. So it's not macrocosmos is not merely imaginary, but real in some sense, but it is far beyond our reality as a microcosmos. So I would like to hear from you, so whether possibilities would be the case or neither or both. This is my question.
Okay, so thank you for your question. And I rather take the strategy. I think I took the strategy, the former. I think maybe I'm not sure. So when I write this paper, I check sometimes the French version, but I'm not sure the hypothetical. I don't know hypothetical idea there. Yeah, I have to check one more, and then. So my strategy in this paper is like I'd like to draw out the cookies strategy as metaphysical strategy as like starting point is our reality and beyond our reality. It's like maybe he inherits from Bergson, and I think maybe this strategy resonates with Heidegger's metaphysical one, and this is so. But I'm not sure that so I think, for example, we will take the problem of contingencies, and on the other hand, I think I can also break the second possibility because I'm not sure. So maybe there is a difference. Or I think the difference of emphasis of discussion of his theory of temporality and his theory of contingency. I don't know, but for example, if I see the problem of contingency, then in particular in his discussion on metaphysical or 理説的偶然 is his disjunctive contingency, then he does not think only what we can think of. Well, I'm not sure. To be honest, in this paper, I took the first way. So it's like it's hypothetical. It's like think of it's like
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Okada.